Consider a moment frozen in time on a rain-soaked, muddy frontier in May of 1754. A young, ambitious Virginia officer, barely in his 20s, stands at the precipice of destiny. His name, George Washington. He leads a small, determined band of colonial militia and Native American allies into the dense, foreboding wilderness of what is now western Pennsylvania. Their target, a small French scouting party. What transpired in that secluded glen would not merely be a minor skirmish in a distant land. It would be the spark that ignited a global conflagration, a war that stretched across continents, bled treasuries dry, and inadvertently set the stage for the birth of a new nation. How could a single chaotic encounter in an obscure corner of North America plunge empires into a devastating, 9-year struggle and fundamentally redraw the map of the world? This is the untold origin story, the prelude to revolution, the spark before the fire. The mid-18th century in North America was a powder keg, and the fuse was burning in the fertile, untamed expanse of the Ohio River Valley. This vast territory, stretching from the Appalachian Mountains to the Mississippi River, was a prize coveted by two of the world's most powerful empires, Great Britain and France. For the British, it represented an irresistible opportunity for westward expansion, land speculation, and a burgeoning fur trade. Virginia, in particular, had grand designs on the region, seeing it as a natural extension of its colonial claims. Wealthy Virginians, including members of George Washington's own family and influential figures like Lieutenant Governor Robert Dinwiddie, had formed the Ohio Company of Virginia in 1747. This powerful land speculation company aimed to acquire and settle vast tracts of this disputed land, securing a grant of 500,000 acres in the upper Ohio Valley from the British Crown by 1749. Their vision included trading posts, roads, and ultimately, permanent settlements, all of which promised immense profits. But the French held a different view. To them, the Ohio Valley was a critical link in their expansive North American empire, connecting their settlements in Canada with those in Louisiana. French explorers and fur traders had long established a presence there, fostering intricate alliances with various Native American tribes, including the Algonquin, Lenape, Wyandot, Ojibwe, Ottawa, Shawnee, and Micmac. These relationships, built on trade and mutual respect, were vital to French territorial claims and their lucrative fur trade networks. By the early 1750s, the French began aggressively asserting their control, constructing a chain of forts such as Fort Presque Isle near Lake Erie and Fort Le Boeuf, effectively creating a barrier to British expansion and alarming British colonial authorities. Enter Robert Dinwiddie, the ambitious and determined Lieutenant Governor of Virginia. From 1751 to 1758, Dinwiddie served as the de facto head of the Virginia colony and was a staunch advocate for British expansion. He was also a shareholder in the Ohio Company, giving him a personal stake in the region's future. By 1753, with reports of French incursions mounting, Dinwiddie decided to act. He recognized that if Virginia wanted to secure its claim, a strong message needed to be sent. And who better to deliver it than a young man eager to prove himself, someone with grit, intelligence, and a growing understanding of the frontier? That man was 21-year-old Major George Washington, a burgeoning surveyor with no prior military experience in actual combat, but with an undeniable ambition for prominence and a desire for a commission in the British Army. In October 1753, Dinwiddie dispatched Washington on a perilous mission deep into the Ohio country. His orders were clear: carry a letter to the French commander at Fort Le Boeuf, demanding that French forces vacate lands claimed by Virginia and halt their harassment of English traders. Washington, accompanied by a small party including a French speaker, Jacob Van Brom, and the experienced frontiersman and guide, Christopher Gist, embarked on a grueling 900-mile journey through the rugged wilderness. They traversed snow-covered trails and navigated treacherous rivers, facing the harsh realities of the untamed frontier. On December 11, 1753, after weeks of arduous travel, Washington arrived at Fort Le Boeuf. There, he was politely received by Captain Jacques Legardeur de Saint-Pierre, the French commander. Washington presented Dinwiddie's ultimatum, but the response was unequivocal. The French king's claim to the Ohio Valley was incontestable, and they had no intention of departing. Washington's first diplomatic mission had failed. He returned to Williamsburg in January 1754, bearing the French refusal and a stark report on French strength and their determination to hold the territory. Dinwiddie, enraged by the French defiance, moved quickly. He ordered the construction of a British fort at the strategically vital forks of the Ohio, the confluence of the Allegheny and Monongahela rivers, the future site of Pittsburgh. This location was considered paramount, commanding the entire waterway system. The Ohio Company, in fact, had already begun work on Fort Prince George there. However, the French were even swifter. In April 1754, a much larger French force under Captain Claude Pierre Picotet de Contrecoeur arrived, drove off the small British construction crew, and swiftly erected their own formidable stronghold, christening it Fort Duquesne in honor of the Marquis de Duquesne, the Governor-General of New France. The gauntlet had been thrown. With diplomacy exhausted and the French firmly entrenched, Dinwiddie sought a military solution. He elevated Washington to lieutenant colonel and tasked him with leading a contingent of the newly formed Virginia Regiment, about 160 men, later growing to 400. Washington's mission was to proceed to the forks of the Ohio, complete the British fort, and expel the French. His troops, described by historian Fred Anderson as paupers and vagabonds coerced into service, who were poorly clad, poorly shod, poorly supplied, and as yet wholly untrained, were hardly an elite fighting force. Nevertheless, in April 1754, Washington and his men marched westward, cutting a road through the wilderness towards the forks. As they pressed on, word reached Washington that the French had already occupied the forks and built Fort Duquesne. Instead of retreating, Washington continued to an area known as Great Meadows, a large clearing that offered a source of water and grass. Here, he received crucial intelligence on May 27th. A French scouting party, numbering about 35 men, was camped just a few miles away. This party was led by Ensign Joseph Cowlin de Jumonville, whose mission, according to the French, was to deliver a diplomatic summons to Washington, warning him to withdraw from French-claimed territory. Washington, however, suspected they were spies. Washington consulted with his Native American ally, Tanaquerizin, also known as the Half-King, a Seneca leader who had been appointed by the powerful Iroquois Confederacy to represent other tribes in the Ohio country. Tanaquerizin harbored a deep distrust and animosity towards the French, whom he blamed for the death of his father, stating they had boiled and ate his father. He saw French expansion as a direct threat to Iroquois control and was eager to side with the British. Under the cover of a rainy night on May 28, 1754, Washington, Tanaquerizin, and a combined force of roughly 50 men crept through the dense woods. At dawn, they ambushed Jumonville's unsuspecting camp in a ravine, now known as Jumonville Glen. The skirmish was swift and brutal, lasting only about 15 minutes. 10 French soldiers, including Ensign Jumonville, were killed, and 21 were captured. What happened next became a point of intense controversy. According to French accounts, as Jumonville, wounded, attempted to explain his diplomatic mission through an interpreter, Tanaquerizin stepped forward. Addressing Jumonville in French, he reportedly declared, "Thou art not yet dead, my father," and then split the Frenchman's skull with his tomahawk, scalping him and washing his hands in the victim's brains. Tanaquerizin's warriors then proceeded to kill and scalp most of the other wounded Frenchmen. Washington's own account downplayed the severity of the incident, portraying the French as spies. However, this assassination, as the French called it, was an unprovoked attack during a time of nominal peace, and it served as France's primary justification for war. The Battle of Jumonville Glen officially marked the opening battle of the French and Indian War in North America. Realizing the gravity of his actions and expecting fierce French retaliation, Washington quickly returned to Great Meadows and began hastily constructing a defensive stockade. This crude circular fort, barely 53 feet in diameter, was built in a low-lying area surrounded by woods, a tactically poor position for defense. He named it Fort Necessity. Reinforcements arrived on June 9th, bringing news that Colonel Joshua Fry, the regiment's commanding officer, had died after a fall, leaving Washington in full command. A company of British regulars from South Carolina also joined them, increasing Washington's force to around 400 men. However, the French response was swift and overwhelming. On July 3, 1754, a combined force of approximately 600 French, French-Canadian, and Native American soldiers Led by Louis-Colin de Villers, Jumonville's half-brother, descended upon Fort Necessity. The battle was fought in a torrential downpour, turning the trenches inside the fort into muddy pits. Washington's men, exposed and without adequate cover, were at a severe disadvantage against the French and their allies, who fired from the protection of the surrounding woods. After a 9-hour siege, with heavy casualties and ammunition running low, Washington was forced to negotiate a surrender. The terms of capitulation, written in French, were translated for Washington by Jacob Van Braam, who was reportedly not fluent in both languages. Unbeknownst to Washington at the time, the document he signed included language stating that he had assassinated Jumonville, effectively admitting to a war crime. This signing provided the French with undeniable propaganda, a moral justification for the broader conflict that was now inevitable. On July 4, 1754, a humiliated George Washington and his men marched out of Fort Necessity, defeated, but allowed to withdraw with their arms. The young officer's first taste of military command was a bitter defeat, yet his actions at Jumonville Glen and Fort Necessity, however ill-fated, ignited a firestorm. While Washington may have returned to Williamsburg hailed as a hero for his bravery, his mistakes and failures on this campaign irrevocably escalated the conflict. The events of 1754 had launched the North American theater of what would soon become the 7 Years' War, a truly global conflict. This war would dramatically reshape empires, incur staggering debts for Great Britain, and sow the seeds of discontent that would, just 2 decades later, blossom into the American War for Independence. The spark had indeed become a fire, and its flames would consume an old order, giving rise to a new one. The humiliating defeat at Fort Necessity sent shockwaves across the Atlantic. In London, news of Washington's capitulation and the implicit admission of assassinating Jumonville galvanized the British government. Despite some initial hesitation, Prime Minister Thomas Pelham Hollis, the Duke of Newcastle, pushed for a swift and decisive response, recognizing the critical need to assert British dominance in North America. King George II approved a plan to send a substantial military expedition to dislodge the French from their frontier forts. The chosen leader for this ambitious undertaking was Major General Edward Braddock, a seasoned officer with 45 years of military experience, though primarily in European warfare. Braddock arrived in Virginia in early 1755, entrusted with the command of all British forces in North America and an extraordinary mandate to expel the French from the Ohio Valley. His primary objective was Fort Duquesne, a strategic French stronghold at the confluence of the Allegheny and Monongahela rivers, a site crucial for controlling the contested Ohio Valley. Braddock's personality was a complex blend of bravery, discipline, and a profound, almost hubristic, confidence in the superiority of traditional European military tactics. Benjamin Franklin famously described him as a brave man who might probably have made a figure as a good officer in some European war, but who possessed too much self-confidence, too high an opinion of the validity of regular troops, and too mean a one of both Americans and Indians. Rigid adherence to conventional warfare would prove to be his undoing in the unfamiliar North American wilderness. He expected the colonial assemblies to unite under his leadership and provide resources, but this unity largely failed to materialize, and he often alienated potential Native American allies. The expedition began in May 1755 from Fort Cumberland, Maryland, with a force of approximately 2,100 men, including 2 regiments of British regulars, the 44th and 48th Regiments of Foot, and 700 provincial troops from the colonies. Among his aides was a 23-year-old George Washington, who, despite his recent defeat, had first-hand knowledge of the rugged terrain. The journey itself was an immense logistical challenge. To transport heavy cannons and supplies, Braddock's army had to carve a 110-mile road through dense forests and across the Allegheny Mountains, a painstakingly slow process. This meticulous road building, while a testament to British engineering, also broadcast their approach, giving the French ample warning. Braddock's disdain for colonial fighting methods and Native American intelligence was a critical miscalculation. He had few Native American allies, largely due to his own dismissive attitude, which deprived him of crucial scouting and reconnaissance in the unfamiliar wilderness. In late June, Braddock's scouts discovered signs of French and Native American presence, including painted trees with threats and bravados, indicating the enemy was aware of their advance and preparing for confrontation. On July 9, 1755, just 10 miles from Fort Duquesne, Braddock's column was ambushed near the Monongahela River by a smaller force of French soldiers, Canadian militia, and their Native American allies, numbering around 900. The ensuing Battle of the Monongahela became a catastrophic defeat, a stark lesson in the clash between rigid European military doctrine and fluid frontier warfare. Braddock's troops, accustomed to linear formations and open-field combat, found themselves ensnared in a nightmare. The French and Native Americans, utilizing the dense woods for cover, fired from behind trees and natural obstructions, employing effective skirmishing tactics. The British regulars, in their bright red coats, were conspicuous targets, struggling to maintain formation in the chaotic, smoke-filled forest. Confusion quickly descended. British platoons accidentally fired on their own men, mistaking colonial militia for the enemy. The terrifying war whoops of the Native American warriors further sowed panic and disorder among the ranks. Braddock, brave but inflexible, rode through the fray attempting to rally his men, refusing to allow them to break formation and fight from cover as the enemy did. His unwavering adherence to traditional tactics, even as his army was being decimated, epitomized his psychological blind spot. He believed that superior discipline alone would prevail. Officers, prime targets for the ambushing forces, fell in large numbers. Out of 86 officers, 26 were killed and 37 wounded. After 3 hours of intense fighting, Braddock himself was mortally wounded in the chest. George Washington, despite having several bullets pierce his coat and 2 horses shot from under him, miraculously remained unharmed and helped carry the dying general from the battlefield. The retreat quickly devolved into a rout, a complete collapse of British order. Of the approximately 1,300 men engaged, nearly 900 were killed or wounded, a devastating loss for the British. The French and their allies, in stark contrast, suffered fewer than 50 casualties. Braddock died of his wounds on July 13, 1755, and was buried in the middle of the road his army had painstakingly built, his grave concealed to prevent desecration by the enemy. Braddock's defeat was a profound setback, demonstrating the brutal realities of frontier warfare and highlighting the need for the British to adapt their military strategies. It profoundly impacted British military thinking, showing the vulnerability of conventional forces against effective skirmishers in the wilderness. For the colonists, it raised critical questions about the competence of British leadership and fostered a nascent sense of distinct American identity, particularly among those who witnessed the effectiveness of provincial troops in a style of fighting more suited to the North American environment. The catastrophic failure of Braddock's expedition solidified French control of the Ohio Valley for several more years and proved that the spark, ignited at Fort Necessity, had indeed become a raging, unpredictable fire far more complex and costly than anyone in London had initially imagined. The catastrophic failure of Braddock's expedition solidified French control of the Ohio Valley for several more years and proved that the spark, ignited at Fort Necessity, had indeed become a raging, unpredictable fire far more complex and costly than anyone in London had initially imagined. In the years that followed Braddock's crushing defeat, the tide of war continued to favor the French, whose well-established alliances with numerous Native American tribes and adeptness at guerrilla warfare presented a formidable challenge to conventional British military tactics. French General Louis-Joseph de Montcalm, a brilliant and aggressive commander, capitalized on British disorganization. In August 1756, Montcalm achieved a significant victory by capturing Fort Oswego on Lake Ontario, a vital British trading post and military stronghold. This triumph resulted in the seizure of 1,700 British prisoners and 121 cannons, effectively disrupting British supply lines and removing their presence from Lake Ontario. Just a year later, in August 1757, Montcalm again demonstrated French military prowess by besieging Fort William Henry at the southern end of Lake George. After a 6-day siege, the British garrison, led by Lieutenant Colonel George Monro, was forced to surrender under terms that promised safe passage to Fort Edward. However, what transpired next became one of the war's most infamous and horrific incidents. Montcalm's Native American allies, believing they were denied promised plunder and seeking vengeance, attacked the retreating British and colonial forces. This brutal assault, now known as the Fort William Henry Massacre, resulted in the deaths of an estimated 200 people, further demoralizing the British and intensifying colonial fears of frontier warfare. The grim reality of these early defeats underscored the urgent need for a radical shift in British strategy. That change arrived decisively in 1757 with the appointment of William Pitt the Elder as Great Britain's Secretary of State. Pitt, a visionary and decisive leader, understood that securing North America was paramount for Britain's global ascendancy. He completely overhauled the British war effort, committing unprecedented resources, a greater number of seasoned British regular troops, and more competent military leaders to the American theater. Crucially, Pitt fostered a new level of cooperation with the American colonies by offering substantial financial reimbursements for their contributions to the war effort and by devolving recruitment and supply responsibilities to local colonial authorities. This strategic shift spurred greater colonial involvement. Furthermore, the formidable power of the British Royal Navy was fully leveraged to establish a relentless blockade of French supply lines across the Atlantic, effectively starving New France of vital men and material, a factor often considered decisive in the British victory. This reinvigorated British effort swiftly began to turn the tide. In July 1758, a formidable British expedition, commanded by General Geoffrey Amherst and Brigadier General James Wolfe, successfully laid siege to and captured the key French fortress of Louisbourg on Cape Breton Island. This was a pivotal victory, as the strategically vital fortress controlled the entrance to the St. Lawrence River, thereby opening the essential waterway for a direct assault on the very heart of New France. Later that year, in November 1758, another large British force under General John Forbes advanced towards Fort Duquesne in the Ohio Valley. Faced with overwhelming British numbers and deserted by many of their Native American allies who recognized the shifting balance of power, the French chose to destroy and evacuate the fort rather than allow its capture. The British subsequently built Fort Pitt on its ruins. Named in honor of the architect of their revitalized war effort, William Pitt, a site that would grow into the modern city of Pittsburgh. The true climax of the North American conflict arrived dramatically in September 1759 with the Battle of Quebec. British General James Wolfe spearheaded a daring nocturnal maneuver, scaling the seemingly impregnable cliffs to the Plains of Abraham, a plateau just outside the city walls, utterly surprising the French forces under General Louis-Joseph de Montcalm. On the morning of September 13, 1759, a short but exceptionally brutal battle ensued. In a grim testament to the ferocity of the fighting, both commanding generals, Wolfe and Montcalm, were mortally wounded. The British secured a decisive victory, and Quebec City, the strategic and symbolic heart of New France, surrendered shortly thereafter. Though fighting continued in other parts of the continent, the fall of Quebec marked a definitive turning point in the war. The following year, in September 1760, three converging British armies under the overall command of General Geoffrey Amherst effectively laid siege to Montreal, the last major French stronghold in North America. Facing insurmountable odds and completely cut off from any hope of reinforcement or resupply from France, Governor-General Pierre de Rigaud de Vaudreuil formally surrendered Montreal on September 8, 1760, effectively ending French colonial rule in Canada and marking the conclusion of major hostilities in North America. The spark before the fire had indeed become a conflagration that ultimately consumed the French Empire in North America. The global conflict officially concluded with the signing of the Treaty of Paris on February 10, 1763. Under its sweeping terms, France ceded all its territories in mainland North America east of the Mississippi River, including the entirety of Canada, to Great Britain. Spain, which had allied with France, surrendered Florida to the British but received the vast territory of Louisiana west of the Mississippi from France as compensation for its losses. This monumental reshuffling of the geopolitical map solidified Great Britain's position as the preeminent colonial power in North America, ushering in an era of unprecedented territorial expansion for the British Empire. However, the fruits of victory, as contemporary observers noted, soon brought forth the seeds of trouble for Britain and its American colonies. For the Native American nations, the British victory proved nothing short of disastrous. No longer able to strategically play the rival European powers against each other to protect their interests and lands, they faced unchecked and accelerating encroachment on their ancestral territories by westward-moving Anglo-American settlers. Furthermore, changes in British policy, such as the cessation of traditional gift-giving and new restrictions on the vital gunpowder trade, deeply angered many tribes. This volatile situation erupted in 1763 with Pontiac's War, a widespread Native American uprising against British control in the Great Lakes region and Ohio Valley, further underscoring the immense complexities and costs of securing these newly acquired territories. In an attempt to stabilize the volatile frontier and prevent further costly conflicts with Native American peoples, the British Crown issued the Royal Proclamation of 1763. This significant decree prohibited colonial settlement west of the Appalachian Mountains. While intended to maintain peace and order, the proclamation infuriated American colonists who viewed it as an arbitrary and unjust restriction on their inherent right to westward expansion and a denial of the lands they believed they had fought and earned. The financial burden of the war was immense. Great Britain had amassed a staggering national debt, and to alleviate this, Parliament increasingly sought to impose new taxes and strengthen imperial control over the colonies. Measures such as the Stamp Act and the Townshend Acts, coupled with the continued quartering of British soldiers in colonial towns, ignited widespread resentment and fierce protests throughout the colonies. The war had, paradoxically, also fostered a nascent sense of distinct American identity. Colonial militias had gained invaluable military experience fighting alongside and sometimes more effectively than British regulars, and many colonists began to question the competence of distant British leadership and the fairness of imperial policies that now seemed to threaten their fundamental rights and liberties. The French and Indian War, therefore, was far more than a localized colonial skirmish. It was a global conflict that fundamentally reshaped the continent of North America and the vast British Empire. It provided a young Virginia officer named George Washington with critical military experience and public recognition that would prove invaluable in his future endeavors. But most significantly, the war created a deepening ideological division and a fault line in the empire between Britain and its American colonies, setting in motion a chain of events that would inexorably culminate in the American Revolution. The costly victory, intended to secure and expand the empire, instead laid the crucial groundwork for its eventual fragmentation. The spark before the fire had indeed become a conflagration, not just for the French and Native Americans, but for the very future of British North America itself.